I'm Scott Al Miller. This is my life living in Nicaragua. Today I was talking to one of you guys, and he had some questions about how to find some resources. What they were is really irrelevant. The point was that the discussion really came to understanding how Nicaragua is so much more locally based than many of the places that people might be moving or visiting from. This really requires a pretty simple but an important change in thinking that'll help you understand how to acquire a lot of resources and how to look at things, because it really is a different market and a different place and a different culture than where most people are moving from. And while some of these things are pretty simple, I just stepped on something really sharp. They are, I'm in bare feet. I almost fell over. These things can catch people by surprise. So we're going to talk about that right after the bump. If you're coming from other countries, especially places like the United States, you're normally used to a lot of things that you deal with in normal life being handled by large companies and big chains. It's just how things work. And when you don't have a big company or a large chain, a small company will generally attempt to mimic the behavior of one to make the interface with the business more uniform and accepted, and potentially encourage itself to grow into being a larger company. I had to move away from the really loud dogs. At least now the microphone is not pointed at them, so maybe things are a little bit better, and I don't think my foot is bleeding, but it might be anyway. So when you're in the United States, you have this kind of feel of how businesses are going to be. And so when you're talking about how do I name the thing, right? Whether it's going out to a restaurant or getting some medical service or finding some resource, pretty much anything, you're going to be able to go online, do a quick search, and in most cases find some kind of national association or national chain or single business that goes all over the country, or something that's franchised that will represent whatever you need. In some cases, there's some local businesses that do the same thing as well. In some cases, there's a lot of them, but many times they even connect with national resources to try to kind of merge the worlds together. So we are used to having this approach where we assume large businesses and large resources. So I'll just use an example that came up. Getting in-home healthcare is something that we talk about a bit on the show because it's kind of unique that you're actually able to do that here in Nicaragua. Like, real people are able to go out and have someone, whether a doctor, visit you at home, which we've talked about. Jimmy has had this a bit recently with the damage he did to his foot. So a doctor who lives right there in the village comes by and treats him at the house. Or we've had Kat on an earlier episode a couple of years ago where she had back problems. A doctor and a nurse came with all the medicine and treatments to the house to take care of her. Or my kids have been sick. A doctor has come see them in the house, and so forth. And I have recently needed to have a nurse at home to administer an IV over a period of a few weeks. And all these things are great examples that in everyday life, for things we often would never consider having someone at home for, it's pretty easy to have someone come to your house and provide healthcare. So this brings up the question, how do you find these kinds of resources, whether it's a lawyer or a medical treatment or someone to do lawn care, or you name it? How do you find it? And in all those cases in the United States, you would expect to go to, at very least, some big municipal service, right? Some big company that at least covers the city that you're in, and you call them up and you say where you are, and they send out whatever team is going to handle whatever you need in your home from that place. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in your home, but whatever it is, there's this idea that there's a large central corporate structure, and you kind of deal with things on a highly standardized path. And we understand if you do something in New York and you move to California, that a lot of your thinking is going to have to change. But the style of things doesn't really change, just maybe the name of the business that you're working with. So you have this very different approach. And I'm going to use a concrete example of my in-home nursing care because I think this one's relatively acute. So people may ask, and I get this for a lot of different things, lawyers being another one. People will say, I'm coming to Nicaragua, right? A country. So in your head, say, okay, I'm coming to America. And you may say, where do I find a nurse to come to my house? Or where do I find a good lawyer? And you say, well, I can't answer that, right? Nicaragua is a country. I don't know where you're going to be or who could go out there. But I understand if you were going to the United States, yes, you may say, okay, what part of the country are you going to be in? Well, I'm going to be in the Northeast. Okay, here's a healthcare conglomerate that operates across the Northeast, and Memorial Hermann in Texas, and you can go to them, and anything you need in home, and anything you need in a clinic, and anything you need, they're going to have you covered. They may not be the best, but they definitely have this broad broad-reaching set of services, and you can call them, and they'll cover a really large area of tens of millions of people, and in some cases hundreds of millions of people, depending on what kind of services you're looking at. That's normal and expected. And sure, once you've lived in a place for a long time, you may start to know about other services. But when you're getting started, you approach things this way. But here in Nicaragua, remember, we're an entire country of just 7 million people, and people are spread out all over the country. And we don't tend to have large businesses. We don't have that mechanism that creates the investment, the encouragement for nearly everything to turn into large publicly held businesses the way that it does in the United States. And this isn't a good or bad thing. It's just a cultural difference. The United States has, I was just talking with someone about this the other day, the United States has a tax and incorporation and investment legal framework that encourages the public to invest small amounts in a large number of companies, and it creates a large public space of investment. Nicaragua works extremely differently, where they prioritize individual investments in micro businesses. So there's tons here of very small personally owned businesses where you may meet the owner or meet a family member of the owner or talk to one of just a couple employees in many cases, as opposed to in the United States, you're much more likely to talk to a giant corporation that has no particular owner, and there's every possibility that you and all your neighbors all own some really tiny percentage of that business and many others, right? Everything you deal with on a regular basis, AT&T, Verizon, the healthcare conglomerates, the insurance companies, there's a really good chance that you have, or someone you know has, a very small ownership in those companies, often through a proxy such as a mutual fund. That essentially doesn't exist here in Nicaragua. It's not that it's illegal. Of course, it's legal. Those kinds of things can exist, but they are extremely rare and not the natural way that people think, nor the way that the government encourages people through the legal and tax frameworks. So we just have a completely different world. So the same thing, if you're in the US, right, this big conglomerate that would either be like a national home nurse care association or a single company that you would call, and they would arrange people from who knows where to come out to wherever you are. Here, you would totally expect that wherever you are, you're going to have to base those services off of your exact location. Well, I'm going to be living in this block of this town. Who would come here? And you're going to have to ask those questions locally. In the case of something like that, you may ask at the local clinic or hospital. They will generally have those resources. Of course, you will need a local lawyer for other things. You can often ask them. They're a great resource. Lawyers are just a really great place to go for these kinds of things because obviously they have to have some locality. They live there. They tend to be very educated and connected. They deal with lots of businesses and lots of different people, just the nature of being a lawyer. So they're generally a really good resource that you will have access to because you generally want to have one for just general purpose reasons as an expat. And that's a good starting point. As you get to know your local community, these are things that you gain over time, knowledge of what's available in the local market. Most things, like home medical care, you can go to the hospital and ask that question there. They will generally find someone for you. So you have a path to that, even if you don't have any resources of your own, if it's like your first day in the country. But this is a country that really has I don't want to say as a country level has the assumption, but at a cultural level has the assumption that people really don't move around very much, and everyone accumulates knowledge of local resources through their growing up in the local community, having family in the local community and resources and so forth. So when I go to Managua and hang out with people who grew up there, suddenly they know everyone that they see on the street. They know every business in the area. They know how to get every possible resource you could imagine. Everybody you see on the street is generally a reference for those things because they all have to live this way. It's just how culture works here. If you're an outsider like us, expats and immigrants, it becomes much more difficult because we don't have the knowledge of exactly how to approach it and we don't have the connections. So the first step is understanding that that's how business works here. There isn't big national directories of things. There's basically never, obviously for like internet or something or the electric, yeah, that's different. But anything else is going to be a set of small businesses. Some things are a little bit larger like hospitals, but even hospitals are generally not that large of a business. They don't have these far-reaching tendrils into a million different things. They're relatively isolated, smaller businesses. And so you need to approach things with a different mindset. And that first piece of that is understanding that everything is locally based. A lot of people ask me these questions of all sorts. Where do I find a lawyer? Where do I find a driver? Where do I find a real estate agent? And they do this before they've selected the city or region that they're going to be in, which if you live here, seems outrageously obvious that you can't do that. But I understand to people who are moving in, it's easy to see Nicaragua as like a big village and imagine that any resource you have anywhere in the country will do anything you need anywhere in the country. But that doesn't really work well that way. Imagine saying the same thing about the United States or any given state. Well, I'm moving to Texas, but I'm not going to tell you that. I'm just going to ask, hey, where do I find an American real estate agent? Well, if you're asking me, I'm from Montana. I know this guy who lives in the small village of Montana. That's the one resource I have. Okay, great. And then you call him up and you're like, hey, I'm looking for a house in Houston. And he's gonna be like, why are you calling me? How could I? I'm not licensed there. I'm not aware of the market. I have no resources, no knowledge. You called someone from thousands of miles away. What are you doing? But that's how people often approach Nicaragua. They kind of take it out of the context and forget that it's a country and you really need to make these decisions. I hope you guys can hear the dogs not too much, but understand how hard this is with the amount of road and dog noise going on at all times. It's hard to hear myself talk over the dogs barking. So once you have a solid location, you're able to start actually inquiring about services. Doing so without that is completely fruitless in most cases. You will get information that is at best in the same city that you're going to be, and the chances that it's going to be actually local, which is going to be required for a lot of things, is very, very low. Even if you're here in Leon, for example, generally most services you're going to want from at least your side of the city, if not your own barrio in most cases. And what people refer to as Leon can be a very big area that can be hours across in some cases, depending if they're referring to the city or the departamento. Our southern beaches are legitimately over an hour away, and we're here in the middle, so getting to the northern point up at El Sauce is going to be incredibly far right from the southern beaches. So you really have to understand the context of where you're going to be. And this makes sense if you're thinking about the United States and saying, well, I'm going to be somewhere, I'm going to be living in the general DFW metro area. That's 2 hours from side to side, plus north, south, and traffic and tolls and all kinds of things. You would never say, hey, is there someone who paints houses somewhere in the DFW, right? You want someone from at least the part of the city that you're in, if not closer. You certainly don't want someone driving from hours away to do a small job. They could spend more time traveling than actually doing the job. That would be very easy to have happen. So in other places, we intrinsically know not to look at it as a single tiny place. Nicaragua is a pretty big country, the biggest one in the region. So that's the first thing, right? So we understand we have to know where exactly we're going to be. Then once we're on the ground, or at least are armed with that knowledge, we can attempt to ask local resources how we're going to find certain things. And the same thing is true of finding restaurants. You can't just say, and people really do ask me this. They'll be like, where can I find a good sushi restaurant? And I'm like, do you actually mean in the entire country? Like, I know of some really good ones, but every time I'm going to send you to a place like this, it's going to be all different places. You say, well, I want a great steakhouse. I could send you to the east side of the lake. Well, I want a good sushi place. Well, generally the best one is in Curaçao, what people consider the best one. Well, I'm looking for a really good pasta place. Well, mostly those are going to be in Managua, right? You get big distances. And if you're really interested in over time traveling around the entire country and finding the best Italian restaurant in the whole country, of course, that's what you want to know. But under normal circumstances, they mean, no, I want one close to my house. I say, well, I don't know within 8 hours where your house is. Right. And are you going on foot? Are you taking a taxi? Are you driving? Right. Maybe you're willing to go a little bit farther if you're driving. It should seem obvious. It's just amazing how much people think of Nicaragua as literally smaller than a normal city, even though it's quite a large place. It's much like, it is true. Growing up in New York, I grew up pretty close to Buffalo, in between Rochester and Buffalo. And people from outside of New York, even looking at a map and knowing that it's a really large state, it's something like 9 hours to go from the western edge to the eastern edge by car on high-speed highways. So it's the equivalent of crossing like half of Central America. It's pretty crazy. Even knowing that, people look at it and really think that I lived within a few minutes reach of New York City. They understood that maybe I didn't live in the city, but they always thought that I lived to a point where I would be there every couple days, that it was my sphere of influence, that everything I did was defined by it. And the reality is I never saw New York City until I was 17, and I lived in New York my entire life. No one I knew ever went to New York City. I'm not saying absolutely no one, but it was growing up, I don't know a single person that I grew up with who had ever seen New York City until I did at 17. It was so far away and so considered a different part of the world from us. We never thought of going there, really. We thought of it the same as going to London or Los Angeles. It was a major effort to go there and in no way representative or connected to us. We knew technically we were within the same legal state definition, but that was the extent of it. They aren't even physically connected to New York State. It's on islands south of the state, except I understand Bronx is not, or is connected, rather. But so that kind of thing I did grow up with. So a place that was 500 miles away, or at least 5 hours of travel, was often thought of as being my local thing. So people would be like, "Hey, have you ever seen this thing or that thing that you would have to be walking around Manhattan to have seen?" I'll be like, "Are you kidding? I've never even seen Manhattan or the outskirts of New York City or the Hudson Valley or anything of the sort." Like, it was so disconnected. So that is what's playing out here, and it's a weird thing. Take a minute to look at a map and look at the distances and think about, and people ask me all the time, right, why don't we go show the Caribbean coast? Well, because it might as well be a different country. And for most of the history of Nicaragua, it was another country. It is a really far away place that isn't connected by a lot of things that we do all the time. There's one highway that goes out there. Any trip out there is like quite literally driving to a foreign country like Costa Rica and back just to get to the Caribbean coast, and all of it on a long, empty highway with nothing to do at the end except be in one little small town, which, yes, we want to do, and yes, it'll be interesting, and sure, we want to get out there. But people seem really surprised that we don't just regularly drive 9 hours to go see a really poor small village on the Caribbean coast. To us, that seems crazy that people would expect us to go out there, but to people who haven't been here, it seems crazy that we're not hanging out there at least every few weeks or whatever. So that perspective is often quite shocking. And some people really do travel extensively and are like, "I'm all over the place all the time," and it happens. But mostly, I think people will get here and realize that you don't travel to faraway cities and whatever for every little thing. You want your resources to be local. So it ends up that we spend our time making connections, getting to know people, keeping track of who we know and that handles different things. And other examples of this is like our local Tropigas vendor. We're going to show right over on the, I think we can see at the wall here, we have these blue gas tanks. That is our kitchen fuel. Those get delivered here. And of course, that service is local. We had to find a local vendor for that specific type of tank, and they bring them out for us. And every community in the country has someone who sells those and delivers them. Same thing with our water. It isn't a national water. This is the drinking water. We get bottled water. It's a local service that we call, and they come around on a truck and deliver it to us. That one goes a little bit farther out, but it's still localized. Our power company is relatively localized. Our ISP is kind of localized. Even the big things have some locality to them, but every other service that we deal with and every restaurant on Perdidos Jaw is completely local. There really aren't national chains that are going to deliver to more than one place. When they are, they act completely independently. There's a few like Valenti's Pizza or Pizza Hut or McDonald's that are in at least a couple cities. I think Valenti's is going to be the most cities of any chain, or maybe Tip Top if they are on Perdidos Jaw, which I never look because I don't eat chicken. But it's the exception, not the rule, completely flipped from North America. So having that mindset will make everything a lot easier. It's good to know that that's how things are going to work. People will find that often quite frustrating because it's so different than what they're used to, and it is so difficult to step into a new place. The U.S. is very well designed for mobility physically and geographically around the country. If you're moving to a new place, you know exactly how to order food, get delivery, use an Uber. Every single service you're going to use is the same in California as in New York, with rare exception. And you don't need to go talk to anyone. You can look everything up online very easily and be prepared ahead of time. In Nicaragua, it is the opposite. Moving in is quite hard. There aren't accommodations. There's so few people doing that. There's no money to be made by businesses creating that kind of framework. So everything is just more cost effective when it's word of mouth, because that is free advertising, right? And it's more reliable. That's what people want to use, because it's, oh, who do you use? Well, I'm happy with them. People really do reference the businesses that they really use. And so you get a different experience from that as well. So people really do favor that, doing the same kind of US style framework, because we don't have that forced geographic mobility going on that the US often requires of workers and so forth around the country, and retirees. When you retire, often you can't afford to stay where you are, so you tend to move at that age too. Here, people tend to stay in the same spot for their entire lives, and their children tend to stay there. So everybody has a pretty natural access to these resources, and people who do move generally move because of something that's going to give them some amount of anchor access to those things. So we as expats are often challenged with some things that Nicaraguans would not be, and this can make it quite hard on those first days moving into a place that you don't know how to deal with a lot of things. But the reality is that once you move in, typically you're going to gain these resources quite quickly, and it's not going to be too hard. One of the places where this is more challenging, we saw this in the Allison's Journey videos from a few months ago, that they moved into San Juan del Sur, and within San Juan del Sur they moved into a enclave where lots of their neighbors did not have resources. They did not have resources. And even living there for years, they never gained those community resources that we expect people to find other places. That's a very extreme exception, but it does highlight that these risks exist, and it can happen that you end up never associating with people who have associated with people, and your network, your ecosystem can lack the connections into the greater ecosystem. So it is something to be aware of for sure, but most of us who live in the rest of the country, if we're not in an enclave, if we're not in San Juan del Sur, generally we're going to have friends and neighbors and get to know people very quickly who have many connections. You know, everyone's got someone who delivers water. Everyone has someone who delivers soup in the middle of the night. Everyone has someone that brings tanks of fuel. Everyone has, connections to a hospital or a clinic and can find what you need, even if it's something out of the ordinary. Those things aren't generally too hard, but they are different, and you just have to accommodate for that. Now, if you're moving into a place where you know people, right? When I have people that I know from the channel that are moving here into Leon, often people call on me and they're like, "Hey, do you know someone that has fuel? Do you know who do you call for water?" Right? And it's really simple to share that information. But a lot of you are looking at going places where we don't know anybody, and you're kind of potentially on your own. Of course, you have neighbors and so forth. It's easy to meet people very quickly, but you have to be aware that you can't call us in Leon and say, "Hey, where do I get whatever?" We will have no idea if it's outside of our own community or if we don't happen to have a friend who lives nearby. Of course, people are welcome to call, and I try my best to connect people whenever I can. I'm not saying don't call me. I'm just saying that the expectation that I'm going to have any amount of connections to someone who delivers Tropigas tanks in Esteli is extremely low. There's just no reason for me to have that information, no reason for me to have a connection to it. And to store everybody who does that number from all across the country, I would never even be able to look it up, even if I had that information. So it is a little bit of a challenge that a lot of people face, and they are surprised by it. And mentally preparing that that's what you're going to do is going to make things a little bit easier. But it really isn't that hard under normal circumstances. But it is certainly a shock. Thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. You can also join our channel. You can also go down in the comments and say hello or ask a question. We do have instructions down there on how to send in a video question, which would be fantastic. We love being able to help people out, and putting you guys on the show is a lot of fun. And for those who are following along in my personal life, today is my travel day. This should be the 23rd that this is going live, and on the 23rd, actually on the 22nd. So last night, I went to Managua and stayed at the Best Western, hopefully. That is the plan. I'm recording this a couple days before that. I actually have a quince on Saturday. I'm going to the barber, hopefully filming on Friday. We will see. On Saturday, I have a quince to attend. Sunday, we are heading to Managua to stage by the airport. And Monday, today, we're supposed to be taking off early in the morning from Managua on Avianca. I got this wrong on another video. And flying to Houston Intercontinental Airport in the north, IAH, where we're getting picked up. And so by the time you are seeing this, we should be in southeastern Texas at my sister-in-law's house, hanging out with family, where we will be for the next week or so before we head up to New York. I do have appointments to get my wife and my driver's licenses renewed, so hopefully that will be fine without any problem. And we'll be able to do a lot of driving when we get back. But that's what I have going on today. I will be in Texas for the holidays, which is pretty cool. We haven't been there for 2 years. We spent 2021 celebrating in Nicaragua. 2022, we went to Texas, and I did some videos from up there. But most of you guys hadn't joined the community yet, so that's new. And then in 2023, we just couldn't go, so we stayed here in Nicaragua. 2024, we are heading back again. And that's about it. I will see all of you on Christmas Eve.